Before we begin tonight, take a moment to settle in. Find that comfortable position. Let the sound of the rain create a peaceful space around you. And if you're enjoying this content, please subscribe and leave a like. It truly helps us continue bringing you these deeply researched historical mysteries. Tonight, we're traveling to Ekaterinburg, Russia. July 17, 1918, just past midnight. In the basement of a merchant's house that has been converted into a prison, 11 people stand together. Tsar Nicholas II, the last emperor of Russia, his wife, Alexandra, their 5 children, 22-year-old Olga, 21-year-old Tatiana, 19-year-old Maria, 17-year-old Anastasia, and 13-year-old Alexei. With them stand their loyal doctor, Eugene Botkin, and 3 servants who refuse to abandon them. They've been told they're being moved to a safer location because white army forces are approaching the city. They're half-dressed, having been woken from sleep. Alexandra and Alexei sit in chairs. She's ill, he has hemophilia and struggles to stand for long. The rest of the family stands behind them, almost as if they're posing for a photograph. And then the door opens. Men with guns enter. A sentence is read. And before the family can fully comprehend what's happening, the shooting begins. For 73 years, the fate of the Romanov family would be shrouded in mystery. Soviet authorities claimed Nicholas had been executed, but insisted his family had been moved to a safe location. Rumors swirled that some had escaped. Dozens of pretenders emerged, claiming to be surviving Romanovs. The most famous was Anna Anderson, who spent 64 years insisting she was Grand Duchess Anastasia. But in 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a grave was opened. 9 bodies. In 2007, 2 more sets of remains were found. And through the miracle of DNA science, one of the 20th century's greatest mysteries was finally, definitively solved. This is the story of how science gave names back to the nameless. How genetics ended decades of speculation. How DNA proved what had happened in that basement on that terrible July night. And how, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, some people still refuse to believe. Tonight, we're telling the story of the Romanov family. The murder, the mystery, and the science that finally brought them home. Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov was born in 1868, the eldest son of Tsar Alexander III. He never wanted to be emperor. He once wrote that he had no desire or skill for ruling an empire, but when his father died suddenly in 1894, Nicholas inherited a throne he wasn't prepared to occupy. He was crowned Tsar Nicholas II in Moscow's Assumption Cathedral. During the coronation festivities, a stampede at Kodinka Field killed over 1,000 people. A tragedy that many saw as an omen of his reign to come. But Nicholas pressed forward. He married Princess Alexandra of Hesse, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England. They were deeply in love, devoted to each other in a way that was unusual for royal marriages of the time. Between 1895 and 1901, Alexandra gave birth to 4 daughters: Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. The pressure to produce a male heir was immense. The Russian throne could only pass to a son. Finally, in 1904, Alexandra gave birth to Alexei, the long-awaited heir. But joy turned to horror when it became clear that Alexei had hemophilia. This genetic disorder, passed through Alexandra from her grandmother Queen Victoria, meant that Alexei's blood wouldn't clot properly. Even minor injuries could be life-threatening. The boy spent his childhood in constant pain, often bedridden, carefully guarded against bumps and falls that could cause internal bleeding. Alexandra became obsessed with protecting her son. She turned to mystics and healers, anyone who promised relief for Alexei's suffering. The most famous was Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian peasant with hypnotic eyes who seemed able to ease Alexei's pain. Rasputin's influence over the imperial family, particularly Alexandra, scandalized Russian society and damaged the monarchy's reputation. Meanwhile, Nicholas struggled to lead a nation in crisis. Russia's disastrous defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 triggered the First Revolution. Workers and peasants demanded reform. Nicholas was forced to establish the Duma, a representative assembly. but he repeatedly dissolved it when it opposed him, fueling resentment against the autocracy. In 1914, Nicholas led Russia into World War I. The country was utterly unprepared. Millions of Russian soldiers died, often without proper weapons or supplies. Food shortages plagued the cities. By 1917, Russia was collapsing under the weight of war, famine, and a population desperate for change. In March 1917, the February Revolution erupted. Strikes and protests in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, turned into full-scale uprising. Nicholas tried to return to the capital, but his train was stopped. Military commanders advised him that he had lost the support of the army. On March 15, 1917, Nicholas abdicated the throne, first in favor of his son Alexei, then, knowing the boy's health was too fragile, in favor of his brother Michael. Michael refused the crown. 300 years of Romanov rule ended not with a bang, but with a signature on a document. The provisional government that replaced the Tsar promised to try Nicholas for his crimes against the Russian people. But first, they needed to secure the family. They were initially held at the Alexander Palace, their home outside Petrograd. Then, in August 1917, fearing for their safety as revolutionary fervor grew, the government moved them to Tobolsk in Siberia. Life in Tobolsk was surprisingly comfortable at first. The family lived in the former governor's mansion. They had servants. They could walk in the garden. Nicholas read books aloud to his family in the evenings. The children put on plays. It was imprisonment, but it was gentle imprisonment. Then, in October 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in a coup. The moderate provisional government was swept away. Lenin's communists were far more radical, far more brutal, and they had no interest in trying Nicholas. They wanted him dead. In April 1918, the family was moved again, this time to Ekaterinburg in the Ural Mountains. Bolshevik forces were fighting a civil war against the White Army, counter-revolutionaries who supported the Tsar. Ekaterinburg was deep in Bolshevik territory. The family was placed in the Ipatov House, a two-story merchant's mansion that was renamed the House of Special Purpose. The windows were painted over. High fences were erected. Machine gun nests were installed. This was no longer gentle imprisonment. This was a prison. The family's conditions deteriorated rapidly. Their remaining servants were dismissed. They were placed on soldiers' rations. The guards were openly hostile, scrawling obscene graffiti on the fence. By July 1918, the White Army was approaching Ekaterinburg. Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership faced a decision: what to do with the Romanovs. On July 16, 1918, the order was given. The family would be executed. All of them. Around midnight on July 17, 1918, Yakov Yurovsky, the commandant of the Ipatov House, woke the family. He told them that unrest in the city made it necessary to move them to the basement for their safety. The family dressed quickly. Nicholas carried Alexei, who was too weak to walk. They made their way down the stairs. The basement room was small and semi-underground. Yurovsky brought in chairs for Alexandra and Alexei. The family arranged themselves almost like a family portrait, the adults standing behind the seated pair. For servants stood with them: Dr. Botkin, lady-in-waiting Anna Demidova, cook Ivan Karatanov, and footman Alexei Trupp. Then Yurovsky and 11 other men entered the room. Yurovsky read from a piece of paper. The Ural Regional Soviet had decided that Nicholas Romanov must be executed. Nicholas barely had time to say, "What?" before Yurovsky raised his pistol and shot him in the chest. What followed was chaos. The other executioners opened fire with pistols and rifles. In such a small, crowded space, bullets ricocheted off walls. Some struck the wrong targets. Alexandra and her older daughters tried to cross themselves but were cut down by gunfire. And then something strange happened. The younger daughters, Maria and Anastasia, and Alexei wouldn't die. Bullets seemed to bounce off them. The executioners kept firing, but the children remained standing, screaming in terror. It was only later that the reason became clear. Alexandra had sewn diamonds and jewels into the children's clothing, hidden in the linings of their corsets and undergarments. The family had been carrying their portable wealth, hoping to use it if they ever escaped. But now those jewels acted as armor, deflecting bullets. The executioners resorted to bayonets and rifle butts. The killing took 20 to 30 minutes. It was brutal, messy, and far bloodier than Yurovsky had planned. By the time it was over, 11 people lay dead in that basement room. But the Bolsheviks' work was only beginning. They couldn't simply bury the bodies. If the White Army captured Ekaterinburg and found the grave, the Romanovs would become martyrs. So Yurovsky and his men loaded the bodies onto a truck and drove into the Koptyaki forest, about 12 miles from the city. They tried to dispose of the bodies in an abandoned mine shaft, but it didn't work. The shaft wasn't deep enough, so they brought the bodies back up and tried to burn them with gasoline and sulfuric acid. But human bodies are difficult to burn completely. After hours of work, they had only partially destroyed the corpses. Finally, Yurovsky made a decision. They would bury 9 bodies in one mass grave and 2 bodies, Alexei and one of his sisters, in a separate grave about 70 meters away. The plan was to confuse anyone who might discover the graves. If they found 9 bodies, they would assume they hadn't found the whole family. If they found 2 bodies separately, maybe they wouldn't connect them to the others. The bodies were stripped, mutilated with grenades to make identification difficult, doused with sulfuric acid to destroy facial features, then buried in shallow graves and covered with dirt and wooden planks. A truck was driven back and forth over the sites to compact the earth. On July 18th, the White Army entered Ekaterinburg. They were too late. Within days, an investigator named Nikolai Sokolov began examining the Ipatov house. He found bullet holes in the basement walls, bloodstains on the floor. In the forest, he found burned clothing, jewels, and DR. Botkin's false teeth, but no bodies. Sokolov concluded the family had been murdered, but he could never prove it definitively. For the next 60 years, the Soviet government maintained its story. Nicholas had been executed, but his family had been moved to a safe location. The truth remained buried in the Koptyaki forest. In 1977, 2 men made a discovery that would eventually change history. Alexander Avdenin, a geologist, and Guli Ryabov, a filmmaker, had been researching the Romanov case for years. Using clues from Yurovsky's memoirs, they located what they believed was the mass grave in the Koptyaki forest. They secretly excavated 3 skulls and examined them. But this was still the Soviet Union. The Communist Party did not want the Romanov case reopened. Discussing the imperial family was dangerous. Avdenin and Ryabov reburied the skulls and kept their discovery secret for 12 years. Meanwhile, one name kept appearing in headlines around the world: Anna Anderson. In 1920, a young woman was pulled from a canal in Berlin after an apparent suicide attempt. She refused to give her name. She was placed in a mental asylum, where other patients began to speculate about her identity. One suggested she might be a Russian aristocrat fleeing the revolution. Eventually, the woman began claiming she was Grand Duchess Anastasia Romanova. She said she had survived the execution in the basement, that she had only been knocked unconscious, that a kind soldier had helped her escape, that she had made her way across Europe. The claim was extraordinary. If true, it meant a Romanov had survived. It meant there was an heir to the throne. It meant the Bolsheviks had lied. Some Romanov relatives who met Anna Anderson believed her. They said she knew things only Anastasia could know. She had scars in places Anastasia had scars. She looked like Anastasia. But other relatives, including Anastasia's Aunt Olga, rejected her immediately. They said she was an imposter. Anna Anderson spent the rest of her life, 64 years, maintaining she was Anastasia. She lived with wealthy supporters who believed her story. She filed lawsuits in German courts trying to claim Romanov inheritance. The cases dragged on for decades. German courts eventually ruled that she had failed to prove her identity, but they didn't rule that she wasn't Anastasia. They simply said the evidence was insufficient. In 1968, Anna Anderson moved to the United States. She married a history professor named Jack Manahan in Charlottesville, Virginia. Manahan believed she was Anastasia until the day she died. Their house was notorious, filled with dozens of cats and dogs, filthy, reeking. Neighbors called her Annie Apple. In 1983, authorities found both Anna and Jack suffering from Rocky Mountain spotted fever. Anna was placed in a psychiatric facility for her own safety. Jack tried to abduct her. There was a car chase with police. It ended with both of them in custody. Anna Anderson died in 1984 at age 87. She was cremated, and her ashes were buried in Germany under the name Anastasia. But Anna wasn't the only pretender. Over the years, more than 200 people came forward claiming to be surviving Romanovs. Most claimed to be Anastasia or Alexei. They told elaborate stories of escape, of being smuggled out of Russia, of living in hiding for decades. Some were obvious frauds. Others seemed to genuinely believe their own stories. The persistence of these claims reflected something deeper. People wanted to believe the Romanovs had survived. The story of an entire family executed in a basement was too brutal, too final. The idea that a young princess had escaped and was living secretly somewhere, that was romantic. That was hopeful. That was the stuff of fairy tales. But fairy tales aren't true. And in 1991, the truth was about to come to light. In 1989, during the era of glasnost and perestroika under Mikhail Gorbachev, Guli Ryabov decided it was finally safe to reveal what he and Alexander Avdenin had found 12 years earlier. He told a Moscow newspaper about the grave in the Koptyaki forest. In July 1991, Russian officials conducted an official exhumation. The site was badly damaged during the hasty dig. Precious evidence was destroyed. But they found what they were looking for: 9 skeletons. The remains were in poor condition. Many bones were missing, presumably destroyed by sulfuric acid or grenades. The skulls showed extensive damage, but there were enough remains to work with. The question was, how do you identify 73-year-old bones? In 1991, forensic science was advancing rapidly, but this was still an extraordinary challenge. Russian forensic experts began with traditional methods. They determined the sex and approximate ages of the skeletons. They used facial reconstruction techniques on the skulls. They analyzed bone structure. Based on this analysis, they concluded the grave contained Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 of their daughters, and 4 servants. But 2 children were missing, Alexei and 1 daughter. The Russian experts believed the missing daughter was Maria. American experts who examined the same evidence believed it was Anastasia. This disagreement was significant. If Anastasia was missing, then maybe, just maybe, Anna Anderson's claims could be true. But traditional forensic methods could only go so far. What was needed was DNA testing. And in the early 1990s, DNA science was entering a revolutionary new phase. Dr. Peter Gill, a British forensic scientist, was brought in to lead the DNA analysis. The remains were in poor condition, degraded by time, acid, and the elements. But Gill's team was able to extract mitochondrial DNA from the bones. Mitochondrial DNA is special. Unlike nuclear DNA, which you inherit from both parents, mitochondrial DNA comes only from your mother. It's passed down unchanged through the maternal line. This means you have the same mitochondrial DNA as your mother's mother, and so on back through generations. To prove the skeletons were the Romanovs, Gill's team needed samples from living maternal relatives. They found the perfect source: Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, husband of Queen Elizabeth II. Philip's maternal grandmother was Alexandra's sister. He and Alexandra shared the same mitochondrial DNA line. The team extracted DNA from the skeletal remains and compared it to Prince Philip's blood sample. They also compared it to samples from other living Romanov relatives. The results were published in 1994 in the journal Nature Genetics. The match was nearly perfect. The probability that the remains were not the Romanov family was calculated at less than 1 in several million. 5 skeletons showed familial relationships consistent with Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters. The other 4 skeletons matched the profiles of the servants known to have been killed with the family. The scientific community was convinced. These were the Romanovs. The mystery that had lasted 73 years was solved. But not everyone accepted the findings. Some Russian scientists raised doubts about the DNA testing. The Russian Orthodox Church refused to recognize the remains. They argued that the identification wasn't certain enough. After all, 2 children were still missing. How could anyone be sure these were the Romanovs? And then, in 1994, another DNA test made headlines around the world. When Anna Anderson died in 1984, her body was cremated. But in 1979, she had undergone surgery to remove part of her intestines. The tissue sample had been preserved in a hospital in Charlottesville, Virginia. In 1994, that tissue sample was about to become crucial evidence. Dr. Peter Gill, the same scientist who had identified the Romanov remains, agreed to test Anna Anderson's DNA. The tissue was extracted from its paraffin block. DNA was carefully isolated, and then it was compared to 2 sources, the Romanov family remains and DNA from Karl Mocher, a great-nephew of a Polish woman named Franziska Shanskowska. The results were definitive. Anna Anderson's DNA did not match the Romanovs. Not even close. But it did match Karl Mocher with a probability of 98.5%. Anna Anderson was not Anastasia Romanova. She was Franziska Shanskowska. Franziska was born in 1896 near the Polish border. During World War I, she worked in a munitions factory in Berlin. Her fiancé was killed at the front. Shortly after, a grenade exploded at the factory, killing her foreman and severely injuring Franziska. She suffered head injuries and psychological trauma. In 1916, she was declared insane and spent time in psychiatric hospitals. In early 1920, Franziska disappeared. A few weeks later, a woman was pulled from a Berlin canal. That woman eventually claimed to be Anastasia. The timelines matched perfectly. In 1927, a private investigator hired by Anastasia's relatives had already identified Anna Anderson as Franziska Shanskowska. Witnesses came forward. Franziska's own brother met with Anna and initially said, "That is my sister." But then he changed his mind and refused to sign an affidavit. The evidence was circumstantial. Nothing could be proven definitively in 1927. But now, in 1994, DNA provided proof. Franziska Shanskowska had assumed a new identity, either through delusion or deliberate fraud, and had maintained it for 64 years. Anna Anderson's supporters refused to accept the DNA evidence. They raised doubts about the chain of custody for the tissue sample. They questioned whether the sample really came from Anna. They suggested contamination. They proposed elaborate conspiracy theories. But additional testing on strands of Anna's hair, preserved in a book that had belonged to her husband, confirmed the results. The hair matched the intestinal tissue. Both matched Karl Mocher. Neither matched the Romanovs. The scientific verdict was clear. Anna Anderson was an imposter. Whether she was a deliberate fraud or genuinely deluded is still debated. But she was definitely not Anastasia Romanova. In 2007, researchers tested DNA from the actual Anastasia's remains found in 1991. The mitochondrial DNA was identical to her mother Alexandra's and her sister's. There was now DNA from the real Anastasia, and it definitively proved Anna Anderson was not her. The fairy tale was over. No Romanov had survived the execution in the Ipatov house. Anastasia died that July night in 1918, alongside her entire family. But there was still one mystery left to solve. After the discovery of 9 bodies in 1991, investigators spent years searching for the second grave. They knew from Yurovsky's accounts that 2 bodies had been buried separately. They believed it was Alexei and one of his sisters. But where? Amateur archaeologists and professional teams scoured the Koptyaki forest. They used metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs. The forest is vast. 70 years of erosion and vegetation growth had changed the landscape. Finding a small, unmarked grave was like searching for a needle in a haystack. Then, in July 2007, Sergei Plotnikov, a local builder and amateur archaeologist, was walking in the forest with his young sons. He was using a metal detector. About 70 meters from the original gravesite, the detector signaled. Plotnikov began to dig. What he found were charred bone fragments, 44 pieces, heavily burned and broken. This was the second grave. The fragments were sent to laboratories in Russia and the United States. Multiple teams conducted DNA testing independently to ensure accuracy. They used mitochondrial DNA testing, nuclear DNA testing, and Y chromosome testing. Every test pointed to the same conclusion. The remains belonged to a young male and a young female. Both were children of Nicholas II and Alexandra Fyodorovna. The male was Alexei, the heir to the throne. The female was one of his sisters, either Maria or Anastasia. The debate over which sister continued, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that all 7 Romanovs had been accounted for. The probability that these remains were not the missing Romanov children was calculated at less than 1 in a septillion. That's 1 followed by 24 zeros. The evidence was as close to absolute certainty as science can provide. In 2018, to settle any remaining doubts, Russian investigators conducted even more DNA testing. They exhumed the remains of Nicholas II's father, Tsar Alexander III, to confirm the paternal line. They took new samples from living Romanov descendants. Every test confirmed what the 1991, 1994, and 2007 tests had shown. The Romanov family, Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, were all killed in the basement of the Ipatov house on July 17, 1918. None survived. None escaped. The pretenders were all frauds or deluded. The fairy tale of the surviving princess was just that, a fairy tale. In 1998, the remains from the first grave were finally laid to rest. Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters were buried in the St. Catherine Chapel at St. Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, the traditional resting place of Russian monarchs. The Russian Orthodox Church attended the ceremony but refused to fully endorse the identification. They wanted to be extra sure. The remains of Alexei and his sister, found in 2007, have never been buried. They remain in a Russian state archive, awaiting the day when the Orthodox Church will accept them. In 2000, the Church canonized the Romanov family as passion bearers, saints who faced death with Christian humility. But the Church still won't officially recognize the DNA evidence. For many, this seems absurd. The science is overwhelming. But for others, particularly in Russia, there's a spiritual dimension that science can't address. The Orthodox Church says they need to be certain beyond any doubt before they inter royal saints. And some doubt, however small, remains because of religious rather than scientific concerns. Rain fades to barely audible. The story of the Romanovs is a tragedy. A family destroyed by political forces they couldn't control. An emperor who wasn't suited to rule. A mother who loved her children fiercely but turned to charlatans for help. Children who died for their father's sins. But it's also a story about science. About how DNA technology can solve mysteries that seemed impossible to crack. About how modern genetics can give names back to the nameless and closure to families who lost loved ones generations ago. The Romanov case was one of the first major historical mysteries solved by DNA. It paved the way for countless other identifications. It showed what was possible when forensic science met history, and it definitively ended one of the 20th century's most enduring mysteries. The 11 people who died in that basement on July 17, 1918, are no longer mysteries. They are no longer question marks. They are no longer subjects of speculation and fantasy. They are Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, Alexei, Dr. Botkin, Anna Demidova, Ivan Karatanov, and Alexei Trupp. Their names are known. Their fates are certain. And thanks to DNA science, they will be remembered accurately, not as myths, but as real people who lived and died in one of history's darkest moments. Thank you for listening tonight. If this story moved you, please subscribe and leave a like to help us continue bringing you these deeply researched historical narratives. Sleep well and remember, science has the power to reveal truth, even after a century of mystery. Story 2. Before we begin tonight's journey, I want you to get comfortable. Find that position that feels just right. Let the sound of the rain create a peaceful space around you. And if you're enjoying this content, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It helps us continue bringing you these carefully researched stories. Tonight, we're traveling to New Brunswick, New Jersey. September 16th, 1922. A Saturday morning. The Jazz Age is in full swing. Prohibition has made criminals wealthy and newspapers bold. America is changing, becoming modern, becoming restless. And on this particular September morning, two young lovers walking down a dirt road called DeRussey's Lane are about to stumble upon something that will captivate the entire nation. Raymond Schneider, 23 years old, is walking with his girlfriend, 15-year-old Pearl Bomber. They're using the lane as generations of young couples have before them. Quiet place, private, away from judgmental eyes. But as they walk, they spot something unusual beneath a crab apple tree. A man and a woman lying on their backs in the grass. The man wears a dark gray suit, white shirt, stiff white collar. His Panama hat covers his face as though shielding him from the sun. The woman lies beside him, her head resting on his outstretched arm, her hand placed gently on his knee. She wears a blue dress with red polka dots. Her legs are crossed demurely. Everything looks almost peaceful, almost like they're sleeping, but they're not sleeping. Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall, 41 years old, Episcopal minister of St. John the Evangelist Church, has been shot once in the head. Eleanor Mills, 34 years old, choir singer and wife of the church sexton, has been shot 3 times. Her throat has been slashed. Her tongue has been cut out. Around their bodies lie torn love letters, scattered like fallen leaves, revealing the secret that apparently cost them their lives. This isn't just murder. This is theater. This is a message. And for the next 4 years, it will be one of the most talked about cases in America, until a tabloid newspaper resurrects it, forcing a trial that will become the media sensation of 1926. Second only to the Lindbergh kidnapping case that would come years later. This is the story of passion and jealousy, of wealth and class, of a pig farmer on a mule who claimed to witness everything, of a widow with powerful family connections who stood trial for murder, and of a case that remains officially unsolved to this day. Edward Wheeler Hall was born in Brooklyn, New York, in 1881. He studied theology in Manhattan and was ordained as an Episcopal priest. By 1909, he had accepted a position as rector at St. John the Evangelist Episcopal Church in New Brunswick, New Jersey. He was well-educated, well-spoken, respected in the community, the kind of minister that parishioners looked up to. In 1911, Edward married Frances Noel Stevens. Frances was 7 years older than Edward. She came from one of New Brunswick's wealthiest and most prominent families. The Stevens family had deep roots in the area. Through her mother's side, she was connected to the Carpenter family and possibly to the Johnson family of Johnson & Johnson medical supply fame. Marrying Frances meant Edward would never have to worry about money. The couple lived at 23 Nickel Avenue in a home befitting their social status. But the marriage was reportedly not a happy one. Some who knew them described it as cold, passionless, more of a business arrangement than a love match. Edward performed his duties as a minister. Frances maintained her social standing, and both seemed to accept that this was what marriage meant for people of their station. Eleanor Reinhardt was born in 1888. She married James Mills, a working-class man who made shoes before becoming the sexton and janitor at St. John the Evangelist Church. Eleanor and James had 2 children, Charlotte and Daniel. They lived modestly at 49 Carmen Street in New Brunswick. Eleanor had a beautiful voice, and she sang in the church choir. She also served as an informal assistant to Reverend Hall, helping him with various church duties. Somewhere around 1920, Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills began an affair. In the close-knit church community, it was an open secret. Parishioners noticed how they looked at each other, how they found reasons to be alone together. They exchanged love letters, passing them discreetly through church hymnals. Over time, more than 30 of these letters would be written. They revealed a passionate relationship, filled with romantic longing and spiritual devotion intertwined. Eleanor's letters spoke of burning, flaming love. Edward's letters expressed guilt over his marital vows, but also his desire to divorce Francis and marry Eleanor. In one letter, Edward wrote about his plans to elope with Eleanor despite opposition from his wife, who had discovered some of the correspondence in 1922. The affair was complicated by the vast class difference between them. Edward came from privilege through his marriage. Eleanor was working class, the wife of a janitor. In the rigid social hierarchy of 1920s New Jersey, this relationship was scandalous not just because of adultery, but because it crossed class lines. Frances Hall knew about the affair. She had found some of the letters. According to later testimony, she confronted her husband about it. But what exactly she did about this knowledge would become the central question of the case. James Mills also knew, or at least suspected. His wife was frequently away from home, claiming church business. But James, like many wrong spouses of that era, seemed to prefer not to know for certain. Acknowledging the affair would mean confronting it, and confrontation meant scandal, divorce, poverty. Sometimes it's easier to look away. But by September 1922, something had changed. According to the love letters found at the crime scene, Edward had decided to leave Frances. He and Eleanor were going to elope. They were going to start a new life together, social consequences be damned. And then, on the night of September 14th, 1922, both of them disappeared. On the evening of September 14th, Edward Hall received a telephone call at home. He told his visiting niece that he needed to go out, that Mrs. Mills had called about something urgent at the church. He left the house around 7:30 in the evening. He never returned. Eleanor Mills also left her home that evening, telling her husband James that she was going to the church. She walked out the door, and like Edward, she never came home. At 2:30 in the morning, Frances Hall noticed her husband hadn't returned. This was unusual. She woke her brother Willie Stevens, who lived with her and Edward. Together, they went to the church to search for Edward. They found nothing. The church was locked and empty. They returned home and waited. For 2 days, both Edward and Eleanor were missing. Neither family knew where they were. Neither family reported them missing to police. Perhaps they were embarrassed. Perhaps they suspected the truth but didn't want to acknowledge it publicly. On the morning of September 16th, Raymond Schneider and Pearl Baumer were walking down to Russey's Lane when they found the bodies under the crabapple tree. The scene was carefully arranged. Edward and Eleanor were positioned side by side, his arm under her shoulder, her hand on his thigh. His Panama hat covered his face. Her dress was pulled modestly below her knees. Edward's calling card was placed at his feet. The staging suggested this wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a crime of sudden passion. This was deliberate, calculated. Someone had taken time after the murders to arrange the bodies, to scatter the love letters, to create a tableau that told a story. A story about adultery, about sin, about punishment. Edward had been shot once in the head with a .32 caliber pistol. Eleanor had been shot 3 times in the head. Her throat had been slashed deeply, and most horrifying, her tongue had been cut out. That particular mutilation struck everyone who heard about it as deeply symbolic. Her tongue, the organ she used to sing in the choir, the organ she used to profess her love to Edward, cut out and taken away. The love letters scattered around the bodies were torn but still readable. The press would later publish them, and they would become a sensation. Intimate, passionate declarations of love between a minister and a married woman. In 1922 America, this was shocking stuff. The initial investigation was plagued by problems from the very beginning. The crime scene was located near the border between Somerset County and Middlesex County. New Brunswick police arrived first, but they soon realized the actual crime scene was in Franklin Township, Somerset County. While authorities argued about jurisdiction, curious onlookers descended on the scene. Hundreds of people trampled through de Russey's Lane. They took souvenirs. They passed Edward Hall's calling card among the crowd like a collectible. They touched everything. The physical evidence was severely compromised before investigators could properly document it. In the days that followed, weekends brought hundreds of cars to the area. Police had to manage traffic. Vendors set up stands to sell peanuts, popcorn, and soft drinks to the curiosity seekers. The murder scene became a carnival. The newspapers went wild. The New Brunswick Daily Home News covered the story extensively. The New York Times provided relatively sober analysis. But it was the new tabloid newspapers, particularly the New York Daily News and the Daily Mirror, that truly sensationalized the case. They published the love letters verbatim. They speculated wildly about suspects. They ran photographs and illustrations. They interviewed anyone remotely connected to the case. America couldn't get enough of it. A prominent minister, a choir singer, a secret affair, passionate love letters, brutal murder, scattered evidence, wealthy families, class conflict. It had everything. Somerset County Prosecutor Joseph Stricker took charge of the investigation. He had hundreds of potential witnesses to interview: servants in the Hall home, parishioners at St. John the Evangelist, neighbors, anyone who might have seen or heard something on the night of September 14th. Suspicion immediately fell on the obvious suspects. Frances Hall, the wronged wife with the wealth and social standing to protect. Her brothers, Henry Stevens and Willie Stevens, who might have acted to protect their sister's honor and the family's reputation. And her cousin, Henry Carpenter, who lived just 2 doors away. Frances Hall was 48 years old. She came from money and had been raised to understand the importance of social position. If Edward divorced her to marry a working-class choir singer, it would be a public humiliation. She would become the subject of gossip and pity. For a woman of her background, that might be worse than death. Henry Stevens was a retired exhibition marksman. He was skilled with firearms. He owned a .32 caliber pistol, similar to the weapon used in the murders. The prosecution would later theorize that Henry fired the shots that killed Edward and Eleanor. Willie Stevens was perhaps the most colorful member of the family. He was developmentally disabled, what today we might recognize as high-functioning autism, though that diagnosis didn't exist in 1922. He lived with Frances and Edward. He was incapable of holding a job and spent most of his time at the local firehouse. He was eccentric but well-liked in the community. Despite his limitations, he would later prove to be a surprisingly effective witness in his own defense. The prosecutor brought in dozens of witnesses. Some claimed they had seen Frances Hall's car near DeRussey's Lane on the night of the murders. Others reported hearing gunshots. Still others offered theories about what might have happened, but none of it was solid evidence. It was all hearsay and speculation. The most intriguing witness to emerge in those early weeks was a woman named Jane Gibson. Jane lived near the crime scene in a converted barn. She raised hogs for a living, and she claimed she had witnessed the murders. On the night of September 14th, Jane said her dogs were barking. She suspected thieves were stealing corn from her field. So she mounted her mule, Jenny, and rode out into the darkness to investigate. As she rode down to Russey's Lane, she spotted 4 figures near the crab apple tree. 2 men and 2 women arguing bitterly. Jane claimed she heard a woman shout something about letters. Then she heard gunshots. She saw people fall. She heard a woman scream. And she claimed she could identify the people she had seen. But when she tried to tell this story to police in September 1922, they dismissed her. She was known in the community as eccentric at best, unreliable at worst. Her neighbors called her a liar. Her story kept changing depending on who she told it to. The press, however, loved her. They dubbed her the Pig Woman. It was a sensational nickname for a sensational witness. Jane Gibson, riding her mule through the night, witnessing a double murder, then being ignored by incompetent police. The tabloids ate it up. In October 1922, the Somerset County Grand Jury heard testimony from 67 witnesses, including Jane Gibson. After days of deliberation, they decided not to indict anyone. There wasn't enough evidence to bring charges. The Hall Mills murder case appeared to be heading toward permanent cold case status. Frances Hall resumed her life. her brothers returned to their routines. The church tried to move past the scandal. James Mills continued working as a janitor, and the bodies of Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills were buried, their love affair and violent deaths becoming another tragic story from the Jazz Age. But the newspapers weren't finished. Not by a long shot. For nearly 4 years, the Hall Mills case faded from headlines. Life moved on. Frances Hall maintained her dignified silence. The church rebuilt its reputation. New Brunswick returned to normal. But in July 1926, a piano tuner named Arthur Reel filed for an annulment of his 10-month marriage. The reason he gave was extraordinary. His wife, Louise Geist Reel, had been a maid in the Hall household in 1922. According to Arthur, Louise had withheld knowledge about the Hall Mills case. He claimed that on September 14, 1922, Louise told Frances Hall that Edward intended to elope with Eleanor Mills. And later that night, Louise had accompanied Frances Hall and Willie Stevens to de Russey's Lane, where the murders occurred. Arthur Reel claimed his wife had been paid $5,000 for her silence. Louise Reel denied everything. She called her husband's petition a pack of lies. But the newspapers didn't care whether it was true. They had a new angle on the Hall Mills case, and they ran with it. The New York Daily Mirror, a new tabloid founded by William Randolph Hearst, was locked in a circulation war with the established Daily News. The Mirror's editor saw the Hall Mills case as an opportunity. If they could reopen the investigation, if they could get an arrest and trial, their circulation would skyrocket. For 3 weeks in July 1926, the Mirror ran sensational headlines. Hall Mills murder mystery bared. Hall's bribery revealed. Mrs. Hall's spies held town in terror. How Hidden Hand balked Hall murder justice. The stories were inflammatory, poorly sourced, and wildly speculative. But they worked. The public was fascinated all over again. And more importantly, political pressure began mounting on New Jersey Governor A. Harry Moore to reopen the case. On July 28, 1926, at midnight, Frances Hall was arrested at her home and arraigned. Over the following weeks, her brothers Henry and Willie were also arrested, along with their cousin Henry Carpenter. The tabloids had succeeded. 4 years after the murders, the Hall Mills case was back. And this time, there would be a trial. In late October 1926, a Somerset County grand jury indicted all 4 defendants on charges of first-degree murder. However, prosecutors decided to try Henry Carpenter separately, as the evidence against him was weakest. In the end, he was never brought to trial. The charges were eventually dropped. The trial of Frances Hall, Henry Stevens, and Willie Stevens began on November 3, 1926, at the Somerset County Courthouse in Somerville. It would last 30 days and become one of the most publicized trials in American history up to that point. The courthouse in Somerville transformed into a media circus. More than 300 reporters descended on the small town. They leased 60 telephone and telegraph wires specifically for the trial. A 129-position switchboard was moved in from the recent Jack Dempsey versus Gene Tunney prize fight in Philadelphia. Famous writers covered the trial, including Damon Runyon, mystery novelist Mary Roberts Reinhardt, journalist H. L. Mencken, and evangelist Billy Sunday. Main Street in Somerville filled with souvenir stands and refreshment vendors. It was described by one observer as a country fair. People traveled from across the country to attend the trial or simply to be near the courthouse where history was being made. The prosecution was led by Special Prosecutor Alexander Simpson. The defense team included Robert McCarter, a former New Jersey Attorney General, and Timothy Pfeiffer. 2 judges presided, Charles Parker and Frank Cleary, to handle the immense public interest and legal complexity. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. Frances Hall had learned her husband intended to elope with Eleanor Mills. Consumed by jealousy and concerned about public humiliation, she enlisted her brothers to help her catch Edward and Eleanor together. On the night of September 14th, they confronted the lovers at de Russey's Lane. An argument ensued. Henry Stevens, the marksman, shot both victims. They staged the scene afterward to send a message about adultery and betrayal. The evidence the prosecution presented included witness testimony about Frances Hall hiring private detectives to follow her husband, statements from people who claimed they saw the Hall family car near the crime scene, and most dramatically, the testimony of Jane Gibson, the pig woman. On November 18, 1926, Jane Gibson was brought to the Somerset County Courthouse to testify. She was terminally ill with cancer. Too weak to walk, she was transported by ambulance and wheeled into the courtroom on a hospital bed. A doctor and 2 nurses attended her. The scene was extraordinary. The bed was positioned facing the jury box. Jane lay flat, dramatically frail, attended by medical staff. In the front row of the gallery sat her 76-year-old mother, who would periodically mutter loud enough for people to hear, "She's a liar, she's a liar, she's a liar." Jane Gibson's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. She described mounting her mule Jenny on the night of September 14th to chase corn thieves. She rode toward De Russey's Lane and saw 4 figures near the crab apple tree, 2 men and 2 women arguing. She claimed she heard a woman shout something about explaining letters. Then came gunshots. People fell. She heard screams. And then, in the courtroom, Jane Gibson rose dramatically from her hospital bed and pointed her finger directly at the defendants. She identified Frances Hall, Henry Stevens, and Willie Stevens as the people she had seen that night. The New York Daily Mirror called it the most dramatic scene ever witnessed in a courtroom. The prosecution was thrilled. This was the eyewitness testimony they needed. Jane Gibson had witnessed the murders, and she was identifying the killers. But then came the cross-examination. Defense attorney Clarence Case began methodically destroying Jane Gibson's credibility. He asked about her marital history. She claimed she was married to a man named Easton, but she couldn't remember in which church or city the ceremony had taken place. For years earlier, she had denied being married at all. Hadn't she been married in 1890 to a man who divorced her in 1898 for adultery? Had she lived with a man named Harry Ray? Had she known someone called Stumpy Gillen? Jane Gibson's answers were vague and evasive. The defense called neighbors who testified that Jane Gibson was known throughout the community as a serial liar. They said she would make up stories for attention. One witness testified that a civilian had bribed her $100 to corroborate a false story years earlier. And then there was her mother in the front row, muttering throughout the testimony that her own daughter was lying. The defense actually called Jane Gibson's mother to the stand to testify against her daughter's character. The most damaging problem with Jane Gibson's testimony was that it kept changing. Her account in 1926 was far more detailed than what she had told police in 1922. She seemed to have convenient recovered memories that aligned perfectly with what the newspapers had been speculating about for years. Her story began to sound suspiciously like she had been reading the tabloids and incorporating their theories into her testimony. There was also a timing problem. The medical examiner's report indicated that Edward Hall had been shot from above, suggesting someone standing over him. But Jane Gibson's testimony described the shots being fired while people were standing and arguing, not execution style. The defense hammered away at these inconsistencies. By the time Jane Gibson's testimony concluded, the jury looked skeptical. One juror later admitted he would have sat in that jury box for 30 years rather than convict anyone based on the pig woman's evidence. The prosecution tried to salvage their case with other evidence. They called fingerprint experts who testified that Willie Stevens' thumbprint appeared on Edward Hall's calling card found at the scene. But the defense pointed out that the card had been handled by police, reporters, and countless curious onlookers. It had even spent 3 years in the possession of the Daily Mirror's editor. The presence of Willie Stevens' fingerprint on it proved nothing. The defense presented alibis for all 3 defendants. Henry Stevens had been bluefishing on the Jersey Shore on the night of the murders. Multiple witnesses placed him there. Frances Hall and Willie Stevens had been at home that evening. After Edward didn't return, they had gone to the church together in the early morning hours to search for him. This was consistent with their statements from 1922. Willie Stevens took the stand in his own defense. Despite his developmental disabilities, he proved to be an effective witness. He was earnest, credible, and even somewhat sympathetic. His eccentric personality came across as genuine rather than deceptive. He calmly and clearly explained his actions on the night in question. The jury seemed to believe him. The trial lasted 30 days. The jury deliberated for 5 hours. On December 3, 1926, they returned their verdict. Francis Hall, not guilty. Henry Stevens, not guilty. Willie Stevens, not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some people were relieved, believing the defendants had been wrongly accused. Others were outraged, convinced that wealth and social status had once again shielded the guilty from justice. The acquittal was based on simple legal reality. The prosecution had failed to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Jane Gibson's testimony was too unreliable. The fingerprint evidence was contaminated. The circumstantial evidence was weak. Yes, Francis Hall had motive. Yes, her brothers had opportunity. But having motive and opportunity is not the same as having proof. Jane Gibson died of cancer on February 7, 1930, less than 4 years after her dramatic courtroom testimony. Her legacy remains that of the case's most notorious and unreliable witness. She transformed the Hall Mills murders into a national spectacle, but her constantly changing story and questionable credibility ultimately undermined the prosecution's entire case. Frances Hall returned to her home on Nickel Avenue and lived quietly until her death in 1942. She never spoke publicly about the murders. Willie Stevens died on December 30th, 1942. Henry Stevens lived until 1939. None of them were ever charged with any crime again. James Mills, Eleanor's widower, died in 1965. He never remarried. He maintained until his death that his wife had not been having an affair with Reverend Hall, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Perhaps denial was easier than acknowledging the truth. The Hall Mills murders remain officially unsolved. No one else was ever seriously investigated. No new evidence has emerged. The case is cold and will almost certainly remain that way forever. Over the decades, the case has been examined in numerous books, articles, and even theatrical productions. In 2022, on the 100th anniversary of the murders, a site-specific theater company in New Jersey staged a performance at the actual church of St. John the Evangelist, recreating the events and aftermath. The case holds a significant place in American cultural history as one of the first true media circuses. The tabloid newspapers covering the Hall Mills trial pioneered techniques of sensational journalism that would become standard in celebrity and crime coverage. The mixture of sex, scandal, religion, and violence proved to be irresistible to readers. Some criminologists and historians believe Frances Hall and her brothers were indeed guilty, but that the prosecution simply couldn't prove it. The bungled initial investigation in 1922 destroyed crucial evidence. By the time the case went to trial in 1926, too much time had passed. Memories had faded. Evidence had been contaminated. Witnesses like Jane Gibson had become unreliable. Others believed the real killers were never identified. Perhaps it was someone else with a motive. Perhaps James Mills, the cuckolded husband, had finally decided to take action. Perhaps it was someone from the church congregation, scandalized by the affair. Perhaps it was a random act of violence that was then staged to look like a revenge killing. We will never know for certain. The truth died with whoever pulled that trigger on the night of September 14, 1922. Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills lie in their graves, their love affair and violent deaths frozen in time. Their story became entertainment, tabloid fodder, a sensational trial. But underneath all the media spectacle were two real people whose lives ended under a crab-apple tree on a lonely lane. The Hall Mills case reminds us that not every mystery has a solution. Not every crime is solved. Sometimes the truth remains buried, despite investigations and trials and media attention. Sometimes all we're left with is questions and speculation and the certainty that somewhere, someone knows what really happened. But they're not telling, and perhaps they never will. Thank you for listening tonight. If this story intrigued you, Please subscribe and leave a like to help us continue bringing you these carefully researched true crime narratives. Sleep well, and remember that beneath every sensational headline is a human tragedy that someone, somewhere, still mourns.